Welcome back, History Seekers. Man, I really like that intro. God, I spent a lot of work on that. I hope you all enjoyed it. Tonight, we have part 2 of the history of the Jews in England. I have branched out into some other sources. I found this book, the Jews in England. However, it was written by a German, so it's possibly a bit biased. Yeah, you can't really take what these Germans say. You know what kind of Germans I'm talking about, right? But we will be continuing mainly with our reading from the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia that we were covering last week. Obviously, I do this stream for the love of the game and for the love of of you all. Hello, chat. But if you want to support the channel, you can do so on the entropy link, which is pinned, or the Ko-Fi. Saturdays, perhaps you could drop the Ko-Fi link in there. All money is gratefully accepted to go towards, therapy beers and other kinds of stuff to keep the show running. So let's get into it, shall we? Okay, so we were up to here we go. Right. The Jews and the baronage, which is about in 1273. However, I wished to read a little bit from this book, the Jews in England, Jewry in England, by Dr. Peter Aldag, Jewry in England, A 1,000-Year History. Now, apparently this is volume 1, so this sort of covers the years up to the expulsion, quite, I guess, in more detail than the Jewish Encyclopedia would. Let me see. So I just thought I'd read like a little bit from this, actually, because as contrasted to the version of the Jewish Encyclopedia, there's a bit more detail in this one. But again, it's written by someone who is German. So, possibly a bit of a slanted point of view. I don't know. So, the earliest years. To this day, the beginnings of Jewish immigration to England are shrouded in complete darkness. Nevertheless, or perhaps because of this, much effort has been made to shed light upon the matter. It is probably due to clever inspiration from the Jews that many English writers are of the opinion that they visited England for reasons of trade as early as the time of King Solomon. Indeed, even serious scholars, under the influence of this clever propaganda, you can see the slant in this, right, have claimed that the British, prior to the immigration of the Angles and the Saxons, were descendants of the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel, who were led into captivity by the Assyrians. Now, this idea of the British being, in fact, one of the lost tribes of Israel is a recurring theme throughout English history and seems to be sort of like basically kind of like pulled out whenever sort of the global Jewry needs like a really sort of good reason to say like, oh, well, we need, we've always been here, right? We need to be here as well. There was notably when Cromwell was got in, or just before the Glorious Revolution, there was a guy called Menachem Israel, if my memory serves me correct. Anyway, he was going around basically saying that coming to England, and he was saying that the 13th lost tribe of Israel had just been found, and it was the American Indians. I don't know how they finagled that, but anyway, that's what they were saying. And therefore, because England was still operating under the Edict of Expulsion, England was the only place on the earth that the Jews were not allowed to be in, and that the return of the Messiah under Protestantism could not happen until the Edict of Expulsion was revoked, which of course happened after Cromwell did the Glorious Revolution and the Puritans came in and all that kind of other stuff, right? It may also be briefly mentioned that, according to the Jews and their allies, the word Britain is of Semitic origin. Herodotus referred to the British Isles as Cassiterides, which means, quote, tin islands. The word Britannicae, which was later used in the Greek language, was merely a mutilation of the Hebrew Barat Anak and must also be translated as the Tin Islands. But all of this is likely nothing more than speculation, and it may indeed be the case that the wish is father to the thought that ancient England should have had such close connections with the original Jews. I mean, you do see this kind of narrative engineering very, very, very commonly, right? So, for example, a lot of Christianity at the moment is stuck in this sort of frame that, because the Jews were before the Christians, the Jews essentially invented Christianity, and therefore you have to understand Judaism in order to understand Christianity. This is not really true. I mean, it's like saying that, to understand sort of any system that rebelled from a previous system, you have to like fully understand that system. I mean, sure, arguably you would want to sort of have a bit of an understanding of why that system was really bad and why it sort of, purposed the evolution of another system. But to say that, it is central to the understanding, I think is a bit much. This is a very, very common sort of trick. We were always here. We have always been here. We were here before you. You owe us for everything. Like, no, right? The first documentary evidence of the presence of the Jews in England, most likely as permanent settlers, can be found in a statue from the year 669. This statue, named Liber Potentialis Theodore Archiepiscopi, oh my God, I suck at reading Latin, Cantorensis Ecclesiae, was enacted by Theodore, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, and included the provision that a Christian woman who accepted gifts from unbaptized Jews or who voluntarily sinned with them, for example, extramarital intercourse, was to be excommunicated for a year, live in the worst conditions of poverty, and then do 9 years of punishment. If, on the other hand, she got involved with a heathen, she would be punished for 7 years. Interesting. What is particularly interesting here is that the dealings with a Jew were punished more severely than dealings with a despised Gentile. Another regulation stated that anyone who, contrary to the decision of the Council of Nicaea, used the Jewish calendar to celebrate Easter on the 14th day of the lunar month was to be excommunicated if he did not repent. Furthermore, a Christian who accepted meat or unleavened bread from unbaptized Jews, or who drank with them and participated in their ungodliness, was to repent with bread and water for 40 days. Meanwhile, if a Christian sold another Christian, even if this person were his slave, to a Jew, he was said to be unworthy of living among Christians until he had bought the Christian back. If for some reason it was not possible for him to do so, he was to use the price he had received to redeem someone else from slavery and abstain from all meat and wine for 3 years. Interesting. So slavery was clearly a thing at that time, but Christianity has always had quite an uneasy relationship with slavery. Unlike Judaism, which, as far as I am aware, doesn't have any problem with slavery at all. I mean, as long as the slaves are Gentiles, obviously, right? Finally, it was not permitted to celebrate Mass in a place where Jews or other unbelievers were buried. Under Ecgbert, Archbishop of York, who lived from 735 to 766, references to Jews can also be found in a law he issued called Excerptiones Egberti Eboracensis Archepiscopi. Oh my God. Someone commented on my last video that the most entertaining part of this stream is like listening to me try and pronounce Italian. If this brings you joy, then I'm very, very glad. According to this law, it was determined that no Christian should dare to profess Judaism or take part in its festivals. It also stipulated that a Christian who sold another Christian to the Jews would be excommunicated from the church. Some people are of the opinion that these laws do not refer to Jews who were resident in England, but one cannot see why else the lawmakers of the time would find it necessary to draft such extensive legislation. Right. So, again, it's not us, right? Like, we never did anything bad, blah, blah, blah. Furthermore, the issues around Christian and Jewish coexistence must have needed to be practically resolved, because these laws feature in the official compendium Ancient Laws and Institutes of England, which evidences the need for permanent regulation. In a Jewish book dating from 1575, Emek Habakar by Joseph Cohen, there is a reference to the fact that in the year 810, many Jews fled from Germany to England and Spain to escape persecution. It must be left open to debate whether this information is in fact correct. Finally, a law is said to have existed under Edward the Confessor, who died in 1066 under the Norman invasion, according to which the Jews were considered the king's property and were therefore under his protection. We covered this extensively in the last episode. Margaluth is willing to recognize this assertion as valid, and it must be stated that this ordinance is also included in the official compendium of ancient laws. This law is found in Latin and English on page 3 of William Romaines, 1753, an answer to a pamphlet. The English translation is below. Be it known also that all the Jews, wheresoever they be in the realm, ought to be under the king's guard and protection as his vassals. Neither can any one of them put himself under the power of any rich person without the king's license, for the Jews and all they have belong to the king. And if any person shall detain them or their money, the king may claim them if he pleases as his own property. So, I mean, it's a weird, as we went over quite a bit in the last episode, it's a weird position to occupy, right? On the one hand, if the king is benevolent to the Jews, right, this sort of gives them great protection, right? They can travel anywhere in the country. They're not bound to the land like the serfs. They can buy and sell wherever they wish, even though this was not permitted to the ordinary citizen. But if the king was against them, then this put them in a terribly, terribly vulnerable spot. This would also seem to outlaw Jewish slaves, because if they're already owned by the king, they can't be owned by anybody else, right? So wait, hang on. 11. There's a cool footnote here, right? So Jacobs in the Jews of Angevin, England, page 3. Jacobs believed that these ecclesiastical ordinances were made to regulate, quote, the passing intercourse with the Gallo-Jewish slave dealers. You will note that this is mentioned in the Jewish Encyclopedia, that that there were Gallo-Jewish slave traders, and this was one of the reasons why they had first contact with the English. The type to whom Pope Gregory I was referring when he complained about the sale of Christians to Jewish slave dealers in the north of Gaul. We know that these Jewish slavers trafficked in English people, certainly in English children, thanks to the famous story about Pope Gregory spying 2 blonde-haired slave children in Rome, asking for their provenance, and on being told that they were Angles, replying, non Angli, sed Angeli, not Angles, but angels. Jacobs made the following disturbingly triumphalist remark on recalling the tale. Remembering that slaves have no nationality, I would suggest that if Gregory had stated the prosaic fact in his world-famous remarks about the chubby blonde-haired lads exposed for sale on the Roman slave market, he would have said, they are not Angles nor angels, but slaves of the Jews. Okay, bold. The first wave of immigration. In 1066, William the Conqueror landed in England, and not long afterwards, the entirety of English life saw itself transformed. Until the conquest by William I, there had only been very loose connections with the European mainland, while relationships with the country itself barely extended beyond the individual counties. Trade was mainly by barter, and the circulation of money was therefore very limited. How backward. William came from France and therefore laid the foundation for the subsequent close relations between these two countries. Under Norman rule, civilization in England also advanced, which in turn caused an increase in demand for goods and services. In the period that followed, difficulties were encountered in satisfying this demand through barter alone, which led to an increase in the need for liquid money. Yeah, barter is a very cagey system upon which to run any kind of serious economy. What generally winds up happening is that, you have some kind of like staple that sort of takes the place of like monetary value, like, a kilo of wheat. They wouldn't have kilos back then. I don't know. A bushel of wheat, a pounding of wheat, whatever a hippany hoppany of wheat, is worth like 2 groats, which is worth like, and if you know anything about the English currency system before it got reformed, relatively recently, I think it was like in the 1970s or 80s, you still had this very, very, very weird currency system that was based on, it's all based on 12s, which actually turned out to be like a lot better than most people thought, because you can divide 12 into 6, 4, 3, 2. So it's actually 12 is actually like a better number than 10 to have your currency on. But you had halfpennies and half halfpennies and pennies and groats and all this kind of like stuff, right? Crowns and and it was very quaint, but it was also like a bit confusing, right? In addition, as a result to the initial hostility of the English population after the conquest, William was forced to enlarge his standing army, for which again he needed money, but which was not sufficiently available in the country. Even the barons who were called upon to finance the army could hardly raise the necessary funds, which made the desire for a money economy universal. The Jews of that time controlled trade and finance to an almost greater extent than today. However, their number in England must not have been sufficient to cover demand. That fact soon became known in northern France, where there were large settlements of rich Jews. Apparently, these turned to William the Conqueror and asked for permission to emigrate to England. Various writers are of the opinion that the Normandy Jews were even invited by William. Although these writers cannot provide documentary evidence for this assertion, they feel it can reasonably be concluded from the country's economic situation. Others argue that the Jews paid the king a sum of money for the right to emigrate to England. Most of them came from ruin. After a short time, we find numerous Jews in the cities of England. The first larger Jewish colonies were probably founded in Oxford and Cambridge, as there is a note in a document made around 1075 in which the ancient writer found, quote, the Jews settled and their numbers great in Oxford, with a similar observation regarding Cambridge. Oxford and Cambridge. The fact that Jewish immigration was considerable is evident from the fact that as early as 1070, it was apparently deemed necessary to determine the legal status of the Jews by law. It was then stipulated that the Jews settled in the kingdom were under the protection of the king and were his property. Okay, so I just thought I'd do a little bit from that. Again, you can see it's not a very sort of glowing book. This, right? So we get on now. We go back to 1273, where the situation of the Jews is beginning to deteriorate, as I was talking about in the last episode. Being sort of, the people of the king being owned by the king was a very, very good deal if the king was sympathetic to you. However, if he was not, this could rapidly turn very sour with things like tallages, which are sort of forced group taxes. So basically, the king comes out and says, right, I need, 5,000, groats or, whatever the pounds from, all the Jews in England. And it's a collective tax, right? And presumably if the collective doesn't pay the tax, then they're also punished collectively. So this is quite, this is sort of, very different to the way we do taxation today, where they just haul you off one at a time, I guess. The Jews and the baronage. But there was probably another reason for limiting Jewish business with the towns, for it is likely that the king derived but very little profit from the loans of the Jews to the burgesses of the towns. For it was with these smaller barons, including the superior clergy, that the Jews transacted most of their business. The smaller barons indeed found themselves between the upper and nether millstone in their borrowings from the Jews, their indebtedness to whom fell in the last resort into the hands of the king, either by eschgiat on the death of the creditor, or by collection made through the king's officials whenever the Jews were tallaged. Okay, so this is quite interesting. So the barons get the borrow money, they get themselves in trouble, right? This is why usury is just a terrible toll upon societies in general. And although it does produce economic growth in the short term, in the same way that powerful and addictive drugs may help you short term with a problem, in the long term, it has incredible, horrible knock on effects. So what basically what this is saying is that when the creditor dies, because Christians were forbidden to propagate usury, the loan would fall into the hands of the king. So you'd wind up paying the king, right? And also, it seems that when a tallage was announced, right, the king would go to the Jews and be like, "Hey, hey Jews, I need a bunch of money," and they'd be like, "Well, I'm owed a bunch of money." But they won't pay. So, right. So then, of course, the tallage begins to descend upon the people who owe money. So the tallage would not just affect the Jews, but also the people who owed money to the Jews. So this would, be an incredible sort of disruption of the economy. But besides this, the higher baronage imitated the crown in making use of the Jews as cat's paws to get the lands of their less powerful brethren into their possession. This is another problem with usury. If you have an heir who is prone to wine, prone to women, prone to luxury, a bit of an idiot or a layabout, it can be incredibly easy to get hold of their assets. You just lend them money, wait for them to drink and whore it all away, and then the lands of that family will fall into your grasp. This is a very underappreciated aspect of predatory usury that I think more people really sort of like need to realize, right? Beware of people who offer you money, right? It's like, look, I just want to give you all this like money. Well, yeah, like, but you gotta think a bit further ahead. Yes, but besides this, the higher baronage imitated the crown in making use of the Jews as cat's paws to get the lands of their less powerful brethren into their possession, advancing money to the Jew, sharing with him the usury, and claiming the lands if the debt failed to be paid. Right. So this guy is basically saying that you would get Christians who would advance money to the Jews because they were not allowed to initiate loans because they were Christians. The Jews would initiate the loans, right? The Christians would take part in the profits of the usury, and when the loan failed, they would get the land. Devilish. Complaint was made of this as early as the Synod of Worcester in 1240, and nearly 20 years later, in 1259, the lesser barons petitioned the king to find some remedy for this danger of getting into the clutches of the higher nobility. With the outbreak of the Barons' War, violent measures were adopted to remove all traces of indebtedness to either the king or to the higher barons. The juries of London, Canterbury, Northampton, Winchester, Cambridge, Worcester, and Lincoln were looted, and the arcae either destroyed or deposited at the headquarters of the barons at Ely. Now, the arcae, if you will remember, is a special sort of loan notice, right? So when you initiated a loan, you'd use a thing called an arcae that would basically make two copies. One of them would go to the Jew that you owed the money to, and the other would get put away in this special chest in the town center, right? And this allowed the king to immediately know who owed like what to everyone. And it was very, very hard to forge. And one of the reasons why they did this, of course, was that it meant that if the angry peasants marched upon the houses of local Jews and burnt all the loan records, there was still another copy, in the cathedral. The king had another copy, right? Truly, it's such a terrible fate, right? Like, you get like a crop failure, right? Everybody's going to starve. Well, what do you get? You could borrow some money, right? Like to survive, like, and then you wind up losing everything anyway, right? Simon de Montfort, indeed, who had at an early stage expelled the Jews from his town of Leicester, when at the height of his power after the Battle of Lewes, annulled all indebtedness to the Jews. He had been accused of sharing the plunder, but issued edicts for their protection after the battle. Both the jury and the king, as its representative, must have suffered incalculably by this general wiping out of indebtedness. So the royalty was in on it. The higher barony was in on it. Usury, despite being forbidden under Christianity, became sort of a fundamental engine of how England worked in this period. And doubtless, this is exactly what Jesus did not want to happen, right? This is why usury is banned under Christianity, is to prevent this kind of like stuff, which causes animosity between peoples and debt slavery and all this other stuff. But, they're probably like, it's like, look, I'll just do a bit of crack and heroin, right? what's the worst thing that can happen? Feels good. This is a great idea. Let's keep doing this. And then, 10 years later, you look like a husk, The value of the jury to the royal treasury had in fact become considerably lessened during the 13th century through two circumstances. The king's income from other sources had continually increased through the century from about £35,000 under Henry II to £65,000 under Edward I. I just want to point out, right, like if you're like, hyperinflation isn't a thing, right? A pound now, right, will buy you a third of a cup of coffee in London, right? Whereas in like the 12th century, the entire income of the king was like £65,000. Now, look, I know a pound back there was like literally like a pound of silver, and a pound of silver now would be worth like, a fuckload. I'm just saying, right? And the contributions of the Jews had decreased both absolutely and relatively. The average from tallages, etc., being about £3,000 per annum in the 12th century, and only £2,000 in the 13th. I mean, one must wonder whether this entire system began to have diminishing returns, right? As the barony sort of sees more and more and more land from the minor nobles, right? Eventually everyone who survives becomes wise to this scheme, right? And is very, very careful whom they borrow from, how they borrow, they presumably start working out ways to like hedge against it. So this is one of these sort of things. I always think of these like systems that sort of ravage a country as a bit like an insecticide or something. You invent like a new insecticide, and for say about 10 years it works brilliantly, and there's literally like no pests, and then they start developing resistance to it, and no. Excuse me. Besides this, the king had found other sources from which to obtain loans. Italian merchants, the Pope's usurers as they were called, supplied him with money at times on the security of the Jewry. Now, this is very, very interesting. Now, what this means is that the king could parlay the Jews in his lands as essentially as a money-bearing asset, right? So he could go to the Italians, right, and say, I need a loan. This would be in Rome or Venice, presumably. And, the Italians would be like, well, how do we know, what assets have you got? How can you pay us back? And he's like, well, I've got these Jews in my lands, and they, they've been giving me like a steady, £3,000 a year. But, if things get tricky, I can always like, tallage them and sort of, like stress them a little bit, and, we can get it out. Right. And so the Italians are like, okay, right, fair enough. But you need to pledge the English Jewry as an asset. No, not an asset. What the hell is I'm looking for? As a security to your loan. Right. So again, like, it's a complicated situation, right? You start as like subjects of the king, and you wind up as subjects of the king. By the contraction of the area in which the Jews were permitted to exercise their money lending activity, their means of profit were lessened. Oh no. While the king, by his continuous exactions, prevented the automatic growth of interest. Oh no. Yeah, I mean, that must have been like great for like stability of the country. On two occasions in 1254 and 1255, the Jews appealed vigorously to the king or to his representative to be allowed to leave the kingdom before the very last penny had been forced from them. See what I'm saying, right? When the king is on your side, everything's great. You get all these like protections, you get like special exemptions, all this kind of other stuff. But if the king turns against you, right? Henry's refusal only served to emphasize their entire dependence upon the royal will. By the middle of the 13th century, the Jews of England, like those of the continent, had become chattels of the king. There appeared to be no limit to the exactions he could impose upon them, although it was obviously against his own interest to deprive them entirely of capital, without which they would not gain for him usurious interest. Fuck, man. Supposed to be a Christian king. That's not very Christian of you, bro. Just saying, right? Like, but you know, it's the goose that laid the golden egg, isn't it? Right? Like, you know, if you tax the Jews too much, right? They've got no money to lend out in order to like gather interest from the, you know, I was going to say the common folk, but I imagine it was probably more from the minor baronage that were like, you know, getting these loans. I don't know. Further prejudice had been raised against the Jews just about this time by the revival of the charge of ritual murder. The king had sold the jury to his brother, Richard of Cornwall, in February 1255 for 5,000 marks. I really need some money, right? Oh, I quite like those Jews of yours. Yeah, look, I'll sell them to you. You know, 5,000 marks, right? Like, you know, clean, right? Now, I imagine that you know, from the point of view of Jewish historians, they would regard these charges of ritual murder as purely invented for political effect. This may or may not be true. Some of them seem to be, but some of them also do not seem to be. I don't think that there is an easy answer to this. Some of them seem to have definitely happened. Some of them do seem to have been like trumped up. And of course, like once it's a bit like what's happening now with the Epstein files, right? Once a few of these get proven, it starts like, you know, it starts whipping around and everyone starts getting in a tizzy, right? So the king had sold the jury to his brother Richard of Cornwall in February 1255 for 5,000 marks and had lost all rights over it for a year. But in the following August, a number of the chief Jews who had assembled at Lincoln to celebrate the marriage of a daughter of Berechiah de Nicole were seized on a charge of having murdered a boy named Hugh. 91 were sent to London to the Tower, 18 were executed for refusal to plead, and the rest were kept in prison until the expiry of Richard's control over their property. See Hugh of Lincoln. Okay, let's have a look. Hugh of Lincoln. Alleged victim of ritual murder by the Jews of Lincoln in 1255. He appears to have been the illegitimate son of a woman named Beatrice and was born in 1247. So he would have been 8 years old. He disappeared July 31st, 1255, and his body was discovered on August 29th was discovered in August 29 in a well belonging to the house of a Jew named Joppin or Josephine. On promise of having his life spared, Joppin was induced by John of Lexington, a priest who was present at the time of the discovery, to confess that the child had been crucified by a number of the most prominent Jews of England who had gone to Lincoln on the pretext of a wedding. This is a persistent rumor as well that there was a certain group they would like meet and they would sort of like pick a town. Obviously they didn't want to get like caught. So they would pick a town, they would all go there, they would abduct a child, they would like do the thing. This sort of, again, sort of echoes of Epstein, echoes of like Satanism, like all this kind of like weird crap. It never seems to go away, right? The remains of the lad were taken to the cathedral and were buried there in great pomp. Henry III, on arriving at Lincoln about a month afterward, revoked the pardon of Joppin and caused him to be dragged around the city, tied to the tail of a wild horse, and then hanged. Woof. The remaining Jews of Lincoln, including some who were there as visitors, probably to attend the marriage of Belecet, daughter of Berechiah de Nicole, were carried to the number of 92 to London, where 18 of them were executed for refusing to plead. Berachia was released, and the remainder lingered in prison until Richard, Earl of Cornwall, who was in possession of the jury at the time, made terms for them. And this is the tomb of St. Hugh in Lincoln Cathedral. I wonder if that's still there or whether it's been destroyed for anti-Semitism. The accusation, as usual, rested upon no particle of evidence. Well, this is the Jewish Encyclopedia. All that was known was that the lad had been found dead, and even if it was a murder, it could not have been connected with any ritual observance on the part of the Jew. But the presuppositions of the time and the confession forced from Joppin caused the case to be prejudged and enabled Henry III to confiscate the property of the executed Jews and to obtain probably a ransom for those afterwards released from captivity. The case made a great impression on the popular mind and forms the theme of various French, Scottish, and English ballads still existing. Chaucer refers to it at the beginning of his Prioress tale. A shrine was erected over Hugh's tomb in Lincoln Cathedral. It was known as the Shrine of Little St. Hugh, to distinguish it from the shrine of Great St. Hugh of Lincoln, the 12th century bishop whose death was mourned equally by Jew and Christian. So, unsurprisingly, the Jewish Encyclopedia says there's nothing to this. It's all blood libel, done for money, and no. Okay, well, they would say that, right? Right. So, so essentially, the rest of the Jews were kept in prison, presumably until they paid like a bunch of money. Man, wealth is a blessing and a curse, depending, very, very much on where you're at. As soon as order was restored after the death of Simon de Montfort, Edward, in whose hands was the ruling power, though he was only the Prince of Wales at the time, took measures to remedy the chief complaints which had led the nobles to the outburst against the Jews. And I mean, this is why usury is a bad idea. I'm telling you, right? Like this stuff always happens. If you hadn't had usury, none of this would have been a problem, right? But then the Jews are like, well, how are we supposed to make money, without usury? And then people are like, well, why can't you just do like normal? Like, why can't you be normal? And then they'll say, well, we're not allowed to like own land, right? We would love to be farmers. I don't believe that. I don't believe that all of these like, rich Jewish like merchants and financiers like secretly in their heart of hearts want to be like shoveling cow shit, right? So it's I don't know, right? But that's what they always say. Like, oh, we would love to be dirt farmers if only we were allowed. No, like look, they're comfortable doing that. They're good at doing it, right? They're good, right? They are good at usury. They are good at banking, right? They are good at mercantile stuff, right? And this can have advantages, but often the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. And if these people aren't very strictly controlled, the amount of money they can accumulate can just distort an entire country, which is, I guess, sort of like what we are seeing here. In 1269, Walter de Merton, the king's counselor, who was himself indebted to the Jews, what a surprise, drew up a measure denying to the latter all right to landed property which might fall into their hands as a result of their money lending. They were not to lend on the security of landed property. All existing bonds on real estate were declared null and void, and any attempt to sell such bonds to Christians was made a capital offense. All this financial speculation stuff, all this paper, bonds, all this shit, none of it is new. None of it is new. Look, this is 1269. And again, right, you're dealing with, the peasantry, who know nothing of this. This is why you need, this is why I think this stuff like always happens. Like sooner or later, stuff gets so unbalanced, things get so out of control that someone steps in and is like, right, that's it. We're canceling all debt to the Jews, because it's become untenable. Essentially, so many people own so much money, it starts crippling the economy. You start getting outbreaks of like starvation. There might even be like enough food to go around, but it's all being like paid off in loans, and like everything starts to come unraveled. But though the barons could no longer alienate their property as security for loans, they could still sell to the Jews. And with this sale, there might fall into Jewish hands the feudal right of tutelage and the ecclesiastical right to advowson, both of which were indissolubly connected with the seizing of a land in Fife. I don't know what that advowson. Anyone in chat know what that means? We can find out together. Advowson. Here we go. The right in English ecclesiastical law of presentation to a vacant benefice. Oh, well, of course, a vacant benefice. I've got one in my backyard. Originally the obligation to defend an ecclesiastical office or a religious house. Right. So I presume that a benefice is like a parish of some kind. Right. A benefice, a church office endowed with fixed capital assets that provide a living. Right. So it's sort of a priestly office that has a stipend attached. The revenue from such assets, a landed estate granted in feudal tenure. Right. So you might have a piece of land that has been granted to the church in a particular area, and the priests of the church, the clergy in that area, are supposed to subsist off the profits of that land. That's how a lot of like monasteries worked. An ecclesiastical living, a church office endowed with revenue for its proper fulfillment, or the revenue itself. Well, there you go. You learned a new word, chat. Right. So the problem is that you might have like churches on this land, and then the churches and the people in them would be owned by the Jews, which is clearly not a very Christian outcome. In 1271, the Jews, as a desperate measure, attempted to force from the King's Council explicit permission to hold land with all of its privileges. But a Franciscan friar made a protest against the impious insolence of the Jews in claiming such rights, and he, being supported by the bishops present, as well as by Prince Edward, who presided, the demands of the Jews were repudiated, and they were furthermore precluded from enjoying freehold in tenures of any kind. They were even forbidden to increase their holdings in London, as this might diminish the tithes of the church. Right. So, of course, the Christians owning lands, gaining income from those lands, had to tithe to the church. If the Jews owned them, they aren't going to like tithe to the church. They aren't Christians. So this is getting quite complicated here, right? Thus, deprived of all security for a large loan, the Jews were almost automatically prevented from obtaining new businesses, and indeed, as soon as the enactment of 1271 was passed, Henry III, or Edward acting in his name, sold the whole revenue of the Jewry to Richard of Cornwall for a sum of 2,000 marks. Interesting. So it's all starting to come a bit undone, right? Like, the cycle completes itself, right? This is what I mean. There's nothing new under the sun, right? And I really think, see, you got to remember, like back in the day, there weren't the kind of like bankruptcy laws that you have now, right? If you take like a country like America, right, for example, that is like just incredibly like run by usury, right? There is also a counterbalance in that you can declare bankruptcy and get out of these loans. There's no such mechanism here, right? Indeed, I believe if you owed money, then when you died, it got passed on to your family. So you could be locked into like a usurious loan at like 80%, literally for 100 years. Not just you, but your descendants and their descendants, right? An incredibly abusive practice, and doubtless exactly what Jesus was warning about, or Christianity generally was warning about by banning usury, right? So you could say that the development of sort of modern usury has also come with these sort of get out of jail cards to stop this kind of widespread rebellion and discontent that would frequently rock countries such as England in this period. The Statutum de Judaismo, 1275. This is where it starts getting very spicy, boys. Shortly after his coronation, Edward I in 1275 determined to solve, by a bold experiment, the Jewish question as it then existed in England. Whoa. I was reliably informed that the idea of the Jewish question was invented by the mustache man and his many hangers-on in sort of mid-20th century Germany. How have I been lied to? Have I been lied to? God, I would certainly hope I haven't been lied to. So again, right? This stuff never changes, right? The Jews and the Christians exist in an uneasy relationship, right? They sort of both like kind of sort of need each other, but sort of like don't. It's they once it gets involved, but it's always an uneasy partnership. Conflict is bound to flare up eventually, right? Hang on a second. Did I hear an entropy? I did. Oh my god. Mikey Bikey for $3 for the picture in the thumbnail. Thank you, Mikey Bikey. And Simon JJ for $25. God, thank you very much, mate. This has been a real eye-opener. Newsfist, great show. Thank you very much, Simon. I appreciate that. It's lovely to see you all. Right. So Edward I, 1275. He's like, I'm gonna solve the Jewish question. Not like that. Not like that. Right. We got another way. Right. The church laws against usury had recently been reiterated with more than usual vehemence at the Council of Lyon in 1274, and Edward in the Statutum de Judaismo absolutely forbade the Jews to lend on usury, but granted them permission to engage in commerce and handicrafts and even take farms for a period not exceeding 10 years, though he expressly excluded them from all of the feudal advantages of the possession of land. So again, right, the Jews would say, well, this is exactly like what we mean, right? We weren't allowed to like own land. But the thing is, under feudalism, that land came with people, right? And you could not have Jews ruling over Christians, right? They would essentially be slaves, right? Feudal slaves of the Jews. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that it was probably believed, possibly for good reason, that the Jews would make very exploitative masters of those feudal people, right? And would treat them badly and would not treat them like, sort of with the deference that belied like a proper Christian, right? But they were allowed to engage in commerce and handicrafts. They could take farms for a period not exceeding 10 years, but they could not own the people on the farms. This permission, however, regarded as a means by which Jews in general could gain a livelihood, was illusory. Farming cannot be taken up at a moment's notice, nor can handicrafts be acquired at once. Okay, right. So no, look, really, we absolutely need to be in usury. Like honestly, there's not, Moreover, in England in the 13th century, the guilds were already securing a monopoly of all skilled labor, and in the majority of markets, only those and in the majority of markets, the only people who could buy and sell were those who were members of the guild merchant. Okay, so basically saying the guilds would not accept the Jews as part of them. The guilds had it like all sewn up. I mean, couldn't the Jews start their own guild? I don't know, right? You see this if you try arguing history with sort of people who are informed on this subject, you often get this sort of thing. Oh, well, there's, really, right, there was nothing else we could do if we were deprived of usury, right? We would all starve. Well, okay, well, look, does that justify the widespread, usurious exploitation of the entire country. Look at all of the trouble that usury has caused England, right? Look at it, right? Like constant social conflicts, constant upheaval, right? This never-ending like battle between Jew and Christian. Is it worth it, right? Like, by depriving the Jews of a resort to usury, Edward was practically preventing them from earning a living at all under the conditions of life then existing in feudal England. And in principle, the Statute of Judaism expelled them 15 years before the final expulsion. Some of the Jews attempted to evade the law by resorting to the tricks of the Corsines, who lent sums and extorted bonds that included both principal and interest. Right. So this is sort of like Islamic banking, right, where the interest is not open-ended. There's like a set amount of interest, right? So you know exactly, you know the maximum amount that you could possibly pay over the life of a loan. Unlike sort of proper usury, which is like open-ended. There's no upper limit to how much money you could pay, and there's usually like a time limit. In Islamic banking, you also have a debt jubilee I think it's every 50 years. So every 50 years, all debts are wiped clean, right? Now, this obviously affects how the market works, right? Like no one's going to issue if someone's issuing you a loan like a year before the debt jubilee comes around, that very, very much changes the calculation. But it's still better than having a situation where people can be bound to loans for hundreds of years, them and their descendants, and no, right? Which is essentially debt slavery. Some resorted to highway robbery. Really? Others joined the Domus the Domus Conversorum, see below, while a considerable number appeared to have resorted to clipping the coin as a means of securing a precarious existence. You see, we're only debasing the currency because you stopped us from lending at extortionate interest rates. I mean, fuck's sake, man. Like, just couldn't you get a proper job? Like, fuck's sake, right? As a consequence, in 1278, the whole of English Jewry was imprisoned, and no less than 293 Jews were executed in London. This was, of course, because of the massive coin clipping ring that was discovered. Now, the way that this is usually dodged is like, oh, well, you know, a lot of Christians were also discovered as part of this coin clipping ring. Yeah, but the people leading it were all Jews, right? The people who owned the machines, right, were all Jews. The ones doing like the clippings, the one who set it up, they were all Jewish, right? The fact that they employed like, you know, some Christians to, you know, presumably like ship the like silver plate and stuff. I'm going to do an episode on this, by the way, right? This is a really, really fascinating story of like how this sort of worked out. They clipped the coins, they'd melt them into like silver or gold plate, and then they'd sell them off to like goldsmiths or jewelers, right? I suspect this might be one of the reasons why like goldsmithing is also regarded as like a very, very sort of like, you know, Jewish occupation, because then you could basically clip the coin, you can sell the gold plate to the jeweler makes it into jewelry and on sells it, and essentially the coins have been laundered at that point. Edward, having found it impossible altogether to prevent usury on the part of the Jews, was forced to permit it in a restricted form in a new statute, probably dated around 1280, allowing the Jews to receive interest on their loans for 3 years or at the most 4. Right. So you make a hard limit to the duration of the loan. Provisions were made that all loans thus negotiated should be duly registered so that the king might have his fair share of the usury of the Jewry. Right. And also the king's like, well, I want a piece, right? So you make your loan payments, and some of the interest goes to the king. The king keeps the record. And also, right, by doing it this way, like you prevent this situation where, you think you've paid off the loan, and then the Jew comes along and says, well, actually, it says right here in my little book that actually you borrowed 150,000, so actually you still owe me, right? This kind of stuff, right? Like, this kind of stuff caused massive interpersonal conflict, right? Loans arranged on these conditions could not be very secure or very lucrative, and the returns to the king in particular would be reduced to their lowest terms by the restricted form in which usury was now permitted. From any removal of these restrictions, Edward was shortly afterwards debarred by an act of the church. Interesting. So does this mean that the fact that he enabled usury at all got him disbarred from the church. Which Edward is this that we are talking about? Edward the First. Let's ask Wikipedia, shall we? Edward the First. Come on. I guess we'll stop it after this. And we'll continue next week. Wait, we got another entropy? Why am I not getting dings from entropy? Something for $5. Jesus would audit the Fed. Jesus would shut that shit like right down, I think, right? So this is there with the first. Childhood marriage, early ambition, the Barons' War. Where does it say? He's off crusading, conquering Wales, war on the continent, great cause. It doesn't really seem to have anything about this. I wonder if this is like one of those like bits of forbidden knowledge that you're not really supposed to think too hard about. He oversaw an overhaul of the coinage system, which was in poor state by 1279. Yeah, I wonder why that is. The coin making system itself was also improved. Really? Gee, I wonder why. Oh, dude. Oh, don't think about it, right? There's probably no reason. Lots of military campaigns. Here we go. Parliament and the expulsion of the Jews. Oh, there we go. No, it doesn't seem to cover it. Well, there you go. Okay, right. So anyway, thank you so much for coming, everybody. We will continue next week with the expulsion proper, essentially, right? Which is like where it all kicks off. And I'll see you then. Thank you so much for everyone who super chatted. Mikey Bikey, Simon JJ, Stumbling. It's great to see you all. And I'll guess, come along to Artie and Fist tomorrow night with Rhetorically Defective. Should I play the intro again to like play us out? I think I will, actually. I really, really, really like it. I think it came out great. We'll play it out. Thanks for coming, everyone. Good night.